Hello, I'm Christina Yetzer-Drain, President of the Shelby Cycle Historical Society and official historian for Shelby Bicycle Days. Shelby had at least 6 companies that made bicycles or parts of bicycles dating from 1892. These companies became well known nationally and even overseas. This is a story of visionaries who overcame many obstacles to provide a livelihood for hundreds of Shelbians. A word first about the evolution of the bicycle. Early bicycles were called ordinary bikes. They were anything but ordinary. They had a large front wheel, were hard to mount, and women and children really couldn't ride it. The safety bike became the standard bicycle in the mid-1880s. Both wheels were equal size, it was a lot more stable, easier to steer, and became very popular with women and children. In fact, it changed the fashion scene for women. No discussion of the bicycle companies that called Shelby home would be complete without a discussion of the first seamless tube industry in America. Henry Lozier was the man who brought the new concern to Shelby. Henry was born in Dearborn County, Indiana in 1843. When he was 17, he left home and was a clerk on an Ohio River steamboat. When he was about 30, he became the general agent in Cleveland, Ohio for New Home sewing machines. In 1887, Lozier started selling bicycles on the side. He partnered with Joseph Yost of Toledo 2 years later to form the Lozier and Yost Manufacturing Company. They sold a very popular children's bike called the Little Giant. Lozier bought out Yost in 1891 and reorganized it as the Lozier Manufacturing Company. He also organized H.A. Lozier and Company in Cleveland and began selling the Cleveland bike. Lozier became one of the big 4 in the cycle industry, along with Colonel Albert Pope, A.H. Overman, and R. Philip Gormley. Because of the high cost of imported steel tubing, Lozier determined that a steel mill should be built in America. He and Yost traveled to England, and in what amounted to industrial spying, Yost obtained a job in a steel mill to learn the trade. The machinery to make sewing machines was similar to making bicycle parts. Lozier came back to Cleveland and enlisted his salesmen to take public subscriptions to attract industry to their town. Whoever could bring the most subscriptions, that's where the company would be built. Shelby at the time was just a country village with one industry, a flour mill. Jonas Feiner was the local agent for the New Home Sewing Machine Company. He traveled the countryside calling on farmers' wives in an open surrey with a platform on back, big enough to hold a sewing machine and his son and his friend. He also sold bicycles for Lozier. Later, he was involved in the Shelby Lamp Company and was inventor of the incandescent lamp holder. Feiner enlisted the help of Captain David Lockard Cockley, a flour mill owner, to secure subscriptions. Cockley had to be persuaded to invest in the company by offering him the president's position. He agreed and began raising money in earnest. Cockley was born in Lexington and volunteered for the Union Army when he was just 17, rising from a private through the ranks to lieutenant in the cavalry. He returned to the area briefly to organize a new company and was elected its captain. Eventually, he commanded an entire regiment, serving 4 years, and received the Congressional Medal of Honor. Cockley was a city councilman and pushed for coal oil lamps on city streets. However, it was unpopular with the residents who thought it was frivolous. In 1895, he became active in the Ohio gubernatorial race, supporting General A.S. Bushnell. At political rallies, Cockley distributed canes made from Shelby seamless tubing. Bushnell was elected, and Cockley became his aide-de-camp, giving him the rank of colonel. He brought the Beardsley and Hubbs Company to town, which manufactured Shelby automobiles from 1901 to 1903. He died of a heart attack December 26, 1901, while entertaining guests at his home. So the story goes, even though there weren't but two men in the whole town who could give $2,000 apiece, they raised $37,500, enough to win the challenge. True to his word, Lozier built the steel mill here. The company was incorporated in 1891 as Lozier Yost Seamless Tube Works, but within 6 months the name was changed to the Shelby Steel Tube Company. Cockley became president of the company. Among the board members was Joe Seltzer. Note that his name will come up several times in this conversation. Among the stockholders was Colonel Albert Pope, owner of Pope Manufacturing in Boston, maker of Columbia bicycles. You'll hear his name again. The factory produced tubing for many of the early bicycle companies. Several of the bicycle companies had similar names, but none were connected through the years. The first bicycle factory in Shelby was created by Seamless Tube Company stockholders. Formed in 1892, a year after the mill was built, the factory was located on Smiley Avenue on the north side of the road between the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad and the Black Fork River. Cockley formed it and was president. It was odd that they formed the company, as it was competition with those they were selling tubing to. I'm not sure that they even produced a bicycle. A depression set in, and the bicycle industry as a whole was devalued. In 1893, the tube company itself stepped in and set up the property as a separate tubing plant. By 1894, they abandoned the plant and sold it to the city. By 1896, bicycles became more standardized, which allowed the tube works to make bicycle parts like frame sets, handlebars, and seat posts, in addition to the raw tubing. Although the Shelby bicycle plant was shut down, in 1895, the Shelby Cycle Club was founded by a group of about 25 cyclists with the object of conducting bicycle races during the summer. David Cockley was chosen president. 9 races were planned from a quarter mile to 5 miles. Prizes included diamonds, gold watches, a sewing machine, a bicycle, a silver water pitcher, and a typewriter. Contestants came from as far as Cleveland. Later, in 1895, Gormley and Jeffrey came to town looking to set up a bicycle factory. Albert Gump, who was in the bicycle trade in Dayton, and R. Philip Gormley of Gormley and Jeffrey in Chicago were talking at a trade show. The Chicago firm produced the pricey Rambler and was interested in producing a mid-level bike. If Gump could find a location for a factory, Gormley would outfit it and Gump could manage it. They found a suitable location in Shelby, the abandoned factory. In 1895, Gormley installed state-of-the-art equipment, including its own electric plant and artificial gas plant. The first order received was for 1,000 bicycles from Thomas Varney of San Francisco, California. Varney owned one of the finest retail bike shops in the world, according to the newspapers of the time. A second order was sent to British Columbia. Men worked day and night, and it was said that passengers on the train could see men hard at work in the glow of lights. Under pressure, they could turn out 200 bicycles in 24 hours. They produced and sold 10,000 ideal bicycles in the first year without advertising. Locally, the bicycles were sold at Seltzer and Steel, a hardware store on Main Street where Suiters is now. One of the owners, Joe Seltzer. In 1899, 3 of the Big Four in bicycle manufacturing, Gormley, Pope, and Lozier, were among 45 bicycle and parts manufacturers that formed a bicycle trust called the American Bicycle Company. The Shelby Company was included in the trust. So what is a trust? Profiteers selected an industry, eliminated a majority of the competition, and then raised the prices and closed surplus factories. There were several plant expansions through the years, adding a blacksmith shop and several buildings, as well as a storehouse near the railroad. By 1900, the company, now under American Bicycle Company, was booming. They received one order for 11,000 bicycles. They worked all summer to fill the order. But the trust was doomed from the start. Many of the companies overvalued their companies in the merger, and while they were supposed to dispose of their debt, many did not. Some subscribers backed out. When the trust collapsed 3 years later, only 12 factories were still open. Shelby's fate was decided before the collapse in 1900, when Gormley died. Jeffrey decided to retire and liquidated his interest in the trust. Gump had already left the company, but he tried to buy the plant. But the trust wasn't interested in creating competition. The plant did close in 1901. The Bicycle Trust was not the only trust that impacted Shelby. The Seamless Tube Company merged with Lozier's Tubing Company and others to form a trust. Just 10 years after the plant was established, Shelby companies produced 90% of the seamless tubing in America. There was about a 20-year lull in bicycle manufacturing, but one company who made handlebars decided to relocate to Shelby. The Chicago Handlebar Company was established in 1896 in Chicago. F. L. Waters, founder, was connected with the organization until his death in 1922. The factory caught fire in 1904, and amid union labor trouble, Waters decided to build elsewhere. The company was already using Shelby tubing, so it made sense to move closer to the source of steel. Shelby also had a supply of skilled workers from the closed bicycle plant. Shelby Tube Superintendent A.C. Morse found out that they wanted to relocate and encouraged them to visit Shelby. The company was days away from signing paperwork to relocate to another town. Waters looked at properties in town, including the second floor of the former bicycle factory on Smiley, now occupied by another company. In the end, Waters felt they needed a new building. Area businessmen agreed at a meeting April 28, 1904, to form a stock company to build a factory building which would be rented to the Chicago company. The company didn't want stockholders, they just asked for a factory to be built and to pay the expenses of moving equipment to Shelby. About $10,000 would need to be raised, and if the rent was enough, stockholders could receive dividends of about 5% a year. About half the money was raised the night of the meeting. Joe Seltzer and others went door to door to businesses to raise the money. They raised all but $500 in 5 days. On May 11th, Waters signed the paperwork to bring the company to Shelby. The Shelby Land Improvement Company was formed. The company was to lease the factory for 10 years with an option to buy at any time. John Hafer, a contractor in Shelby, received the contract to build the building and began to build the 50 by 175-foot brick factory in May. 11 train car loads were needed to move the machinery from Chicago. The building was completed in early August, and Chicago Handlebar was operating by the end of the month. By December 1904, the company had employed 75 men and were shipping goods to Australia, Europe, and all parts of the world. By 1924, the factory made handlebars and seat posts as well as wire furniture that were distributed in every state and in Canada. About 110 were employed and never less than 75. They bought out the Kelly Handlebar department of the American Stove Company in Cleveland and moved the material and equipment to Shelby. The company was bought by the Torrington Company in 1927 for $48,500 and moved to Connecticut. Shelby's third attempt at bicycle manufacturing was a very profitable 30-year venture that almost didn't come to be. The Shelby Cycle Frame Builders was formed in 1921 by Gus Meiselbach of Chicago. They began operations April 24, 1922, making frames and forks. Gus Meiselbach owned a very successful bicycle factory in Milwaukee, building as many as 60,000 bicycles in his best year. The company was sold to the American Bicycle Company Trust in 1900, and he was out of business. He made typewriters for many years. He did keep his hands in the bicycle business, submitting patents as early as 1915 for bicycle parts and methods of manufacturing. His wife, Margaret, is listed on some of the patents. Lured by the abundance of quality seamless tubing from the Ohio Seamless Tube Company in Shelby and the promise of free factory space in the old Shelby Lamp Works, then Tractor and Truck Company building, he started the Shelby Cycle Frame Builders in 1921. They made frames and forks which were then shipped to Chicago Cycle Supply to complete the bikes. The company began buying small amounts of seamless tubing from Ohio Steel Tube in Shelby during February 1922. Random lengths totaling 56 feet, weighing 109 pounds, was included in the first shipment. Then additional shipments of nearly 3,000 pounds and 685 pounds were also delivered across town. They began operations April 24, 1922, making frames and forks. In 1923, Joe Seltzer, one of the stockholders and salesmen for the company, approached Chicago Cycle Supply Company to begin assembling the fork and frames to make complete bikes under the Shelby name. The Shelby Hardware Company, now Roush's on East Main, was the exclusive sale point in Shelby. Meiselbach invented a new way for the tubes to be welded. He claimed they could produce more bikes in a day. The frame parts were arranged and clamped tightly together in accurate alignment and symmetry on the machine. While clamped, they were spot welded by electric or acetylene torch. The weldings were dipped in acid, then brazing material. The tubes were then placed back on the machine to make sure that they were still aligned and true. The process didn't work as well as envisioned, and many frames were returned due to broken welding. The mistake almost put the company under. In 1924, after stockholders abandoned the company amid failed attempts to produce forks and frames, Meiselbach abandoned the company and returned to Chicago. Secretary-Treasurer and Factory Superintendent Leon A. Smith had a vested interest in keeping the factory open. He was about to have a son, Lee. He arranged to supply the Chicago company with parts to keep the factory open. By November 1924, Smith and 18 factory employees began to turn a profit. Joseph Seltzer, a local businessman and Smith's former employer, admired Smith's tenacity and agreed to back the venture. The company name was changed to Shelby Cycle Company in 1925 and expanded to the assembly of complete bikes. Joe became the president. Joe Seltzer was well known in town as a prosperous businessman. Uncle Joe, as townspeople called him, gave as much as he spent on business ventures. He gave money for the park and pool in town. He was one of the original stockholders and board members of the Shelby Steel Tube Company. It would be hard to find anything from that period that he wasn't involved in. He owned Lebanon Farms north of town and raised prize Duroc hogs. Children rode their Shelbys out to his farm for games and picnics. Joe died on a business trip and visit to son Frank in Cleveland. He slipped on ice crossing the street, receiving a slight skull fracture. He lived 3 weeks but never made it back to his beloved Shelby. He died in Lakewood Hospital in 1929. Both Leon Smith and Vice President Clyde Brokaw were written into Joe Seltzer's will, leaving them each 500 shares of company stock. The Shelby Cycle Company owes much of its success to factory superintendent Leon A. Smith. During the 30 years the factory operated, Smith created several new inventions. Smith's first patent was shared with Luther Edgar for the creation of the shock-absorbing steering fork in 1940. The Shockey's shock absorber made for a much improved ride on the rough streets. As the assembly grew after World War II, more efficient machines were needed to keep pace. Smith invented a wheel-spoke nut driving machine in 1947 for assembling and tightening tension of nuts on the wheel's wire spokes. In 1948, he received a patent for a pedestal-mounted tire mounting device used to mount tires on rims with a minimum of manual labor. Smith further refined riding comfort with the invention of the spring-like safety shock absorber for the front fork of the bicycle in 1952. Clarence Wagner really put the infant bicycle company and the town of Shelby on the map when he broke the transcontinental record in 1927. Wagner was born in Terre Haute, Indiana, and served in the 69th Balloon Company with the Army Expeditionary Force during World War I in France. He first rode a bike long distance, a captured German model, in 1918 while in France. He met several people from the cycle company while at a New York City trade show. They struck a deal. All told, he had 3 records of note. The first was a coast-to-coast ride in 1922. The second spanned 3 countries, Canada, America, and Mexico, in 1923. He made the 1,613 miles in 10 days, 7.5 hours, shaving 2 days off the previous record despite tire troubles. All but 20 miles were over dirt roads. Wagner rode coast to coast in August 1927 from Newport Beach to Atlantic City. He traveled over 3,000 miles in 20 days, 17 hours, breaking his own transcontinental record. Wagner averaged about 160 miles in 14 hours a day during the record-breaking trip, with Shelby Cycle Vice President Clyde Brokaw and Dudley Seltzer setting the pace by automobile, while providing a windbreak for the rider. The Whippet held up with no mechanical issues. Wagner telegraphed his progress to the cycle company at points. He rode through 107-degree weather in the Mojave Desert, rode on railroad ties at points, suffered nosebleeds from high-altitude rides, dragged his bike 10 miles through the mud, encountered hundreds of miles of rain and hailstorms, and forded streams 3 feet deep. All told, he rode cross-country 3 times and from Canada to Mexico twice. At one point, Wagner estimated that he had ridden about 85,000 miles on bicycles. Wagner lost his life in a mine accident in Terre Haute in 1936. Just a month after his cross-country trip, September 27, 1927, Wagner rode from Shelby back to Terre Haute, 305 miles in 24 hours with no repairs needed. Wagner's Whippet is now owned by a local collector. Wagner's ride was largely unnoticed as Charles Lindbergh flew the Spirit of St. Louis across the Atlantic Ocean about the same time. The aircraft frame was made with Shelby tubing. In 1930, the company was still sharing the building with the Shelby Paper Box Company. Their departure to Cleveland in 1934 allowed for several expansions. In the years heading up to World War II, the Shelby Cycle Company grew steadily, with several plant expansions in 1930, 1935, 1938, and 1941. This is remarkable considering the stock market collapsed in 1929, triggering the Great Depression from 1930 to 1939. In 1935, with additional space vacated by the box company, the factory employed 250 people, making 500 bikes a day. The factory added one story to the south in 1936 for an additional boiler. They were averaging 4 train car loads each day through the summer. That December, 355 employees received Christmas bonuses of $15 to $125, depending on the length of time with the company. In today's cost, that would be $260 to $2,200. In 1936, the company bought the Suter Furniture Building on Whitney Avenue. The building became the final assembling and shipping area. Between 1936 and 1941, sales averaged nearly $3 million a year, and the factory employed up to 390 people. That would be $52 million in today's economy. No small feat, considering that each bike was custom built after the order was placed. By 1937, Ohio was making half the bikes in America, about 625,000. About 200,000 of those were made in Shelby. There were 400 workers working in 3 shifts, night and day, to keep up with the demand, more than was employed by the Tubby. To supply a growing interest on the West Coast, the company opened assembly plants in Pomona, California, and Portland, Oregon. Parts were manufactured in Shelby and shipped through the Panama Canal for painting and assembling at the western plants. In April 1942, Clyde Brokaw was named to the War Production Board. The board was a 9-man advisory committee to assist in production and rationing affecting the bicycle industry. On September 2, 1942, the War Production Board stopped bicycle production except for 2 plants. Shelby Cycle still had a stockpile of parts to make about 10,000 bikes. A week later, the board allowed them 60 days to deplete their inventory. They stopped production in November 1942 and began war production in 1943. The thriving industrial town of Shelby was not immune to the ravages of war. World War II had begun. In an effort to keep the plant running, the company began to bid on war contracts. They were awarded subcontracts for various items, including rangefinder telescope tubes for new tanks, shells for guns, and over 200,000 sub-caliber airplane rockets. The rockets were training rockets meant to simulate the larger caliber rockets used during the war. Extreme accuracy was required for the rockets provided to the U.S. Navy. The Shelby Company met the challenge and was allowed to complete the contract even after the war ended. The company continued to manufacture a limited number of lightweight bicycles weighing no more than 35 pounds during the war. Salesmen kept careful inventory of parts to keep older bicycles in service. In 1945, regular bike production was resumed. The Shelby Cycle Company was back in the business of producing bicycles by 1945, although steel and rubber were still in short supply. To fill orders more quickly, the most popular models were selected to mass produce to establish a stock that could be shipped on demand. This also enabled the company to keep employees working year-round. Before the war, the factory was only open 8 months of the year when demand was highest. With stock in warehouses, the company signed contracts with nationally known outlets such as Western Auto Stores, Gamble Stores, Sears Roebuck, Montgomery Ward, Spiegel, Gimbels, and others. The 1941 expansion in anticipation of war contracts was a 2-story addition and partial 3rd floor. A $100,000 addition for shipping and receiving was also added. Still in demand in a tight market, but the company was able to keep 290 on the payroll. Bobbie Shelby was a fictional comic book character created by the Shelby Cycle Company in the mid-1940s to early 1950s. His first appearance was in Blue Bolt, July 1946. Comics were especially popular with preteens during that time period, and the Cycle Company was eager to use it as a way to promote bicycling and bicycle safety. The full-page comic strips, for the most part, were not signed. A few bore the signature of Lee Elias, a British immigrant to America who worked for several comic book companies during the 1940s, including DC, Harvey, and Marvel Comics. His most notable work was Black Cat, a stunt woman turned crime fighter for Harvey Comics. The Bobbie Shelby comics usually featured a new bicycle model, like the Donald Duck bike, as well as a clip-out coupon to join the Bike Safety Club. The Shelby Cycle Company also printed one full comic book in 1949 featuring Bobbie Shelby. By the 1950s, about 55% of bicycles purchased in America were foreign-made. With increased cost and dwindling profits from cheaper imports, the decision was made in 1953 to sell the company to Burt Gamble, owner of Gamble Stores, and some of his investors. They contracted with Cleveland Welding Company, a subsidiary of American Machine and Foundry, to continue to build bicycles in Shelby. Under the deal, Cleveland Welding leased the plant. Later that year, the plant on Mack Avenue came under control of AMF, which began to make pin spotters for bowling alleys. Bicycle assembly operations were moved to the cycle plant on East Whitney Avenue. Offices were moved to Mutual Building on Main Street. By January 1954, the operation was moved to the Cleveland Welding plant in Cleveland. April of 1955, the workers went on strike. In May of 1955, AMF announced plans to build a new factory in Little Rock, Arkansas at $1.25 million and closed bicycle production in Cleveland. It took 19 freight cars to haul away the machinery. By July 1955, the strike ended, but the workers had no jobs to come back to. AMF would make bicycles under the Shelby name in Little Rock for about 10 more years. People always asked what happened to the building that housed the cycle factory. The building dated from 1898, when it was built for the Shelby Electric Company, also known as the Shelby Lamp Works. After AMF built a new building on Martin Drive, developers Cousins and Fearn bought the building to turn it into a shopping center and supermarket called Buckeye Mart. Their plans never materialized. It was used for tubing storage for a time. Then Shelby Business Forms bought it to be torn down for land expansion, but instead used it for a parking lot. 11 years after the mighty cycle company was sold, all traces of its existence were gone. The Shelby Justice Center now sits on the land. For more information about the history of Shelby bicycles, visit shelbycyclehistory.org.